Welcome to another episode of Grace on Tap. Grace on Tap is a podcast dedicated to the history and the theology of the Lutheran Reformation, all over a nice cold beer.
I'm Evan Gertner.
And I'm Mike Yeagley.
Welcome to episode 83. In this episode, we will continue to look at a letter that Martin Luther wrote in November of 1527 to John Hess. John Hess had inquired about whether Christians were obligated to stay in a time of plague. And so in November of 1527, while the plague is hit in both Wittenberg and Breslau, where John Hess is, Luther writes this letter. And in our previous episode, we introduced the letter and we described how Luther realized that the topic was so important that he published it as an open letter.
And we left off at a point where we were talking about the importance of vocation. And Luther starts out by talking about the vocation of pastors, and then he goes into the vocation of civil workers, the mayor, police.
Kind of those defined government officials that Romans 13 would be very clear in applying to.
And then the third group, and we didn't get into this quite in the last one, but then he goes into the third estate. They have the first estate, which is the church, and then the second estate is the government, and then the third estate is the family. And whether or not it's in that order, I don't know. But you have there are generally recognized in Luther's era these three estates. And
Luther had the confidence that everybody has an obligation within all three estates, and you're always balancing what is your responsibility inside the church, what is your responsibility to the government, what is your responsibility to the family.
And all of this is part of we'll call it the doctrine of vocation. You know, you have responsibilities in each one of these estates. And so he goes through the importance of the pastorate, meeting their responsibilities, and then he goes into civil servants and the importance of them meeting their responsibilities. And now he's going to talk a little bit about the family.
And he introduces this group by saying, "What I have now said about these two offices must be understood to apply to all other persons who are bound to others by duties and responsibilities. So a servant should not flee from his master, nor a maid from her mistress, unless it be with the knowledge and consent of the master or mistress. On the other hand, a master should not forsake his servant, nor a mistress her maid, unless these are sufficiently provided for some other way or place." So there's always that push-pull of office.
Right. And so he goes, and he lists a bunch of people, the maids, servants, fathers, mothers, physicians. He goes through all of this and just talks about how everybody needs to fulfill their responsibilities. And then he goes into, after he goes through all the people who need to stay, he spends some time talking about biblical people who fled.
So we've got some model of people who are faithful believers, and they flee. Abraham in Genesis 12:13, Isaac in Genesis 26, Jacob in Genesis 27, David in 1 Samuel 19, and the prophet Arijah in Jeremiah 26.
Yeah, that's a prophet that didn't jump out at me, but Luther mentions him, the important, this prophet Arijah, and then Elijah and Moses even.
These are all examples of the faithful fleeing death, and they did so without neglecting their obligations. They did not deprive their neighbor of anything. So that becomes the hinge point for Luther, whether you stay or whether you go, is what do you deprive your neighbor of with the particular vocation you have?
It was interesting when we were going through the whole COVID thing. I actually referenced this a lot. You know, am I hurting anybody by leaving or by not, you know, at what point do I need to stay and put myself in harm's way, and what point is it okay for me to leave? My particular responsibilities are primarily with my family. My work allowed me to work from home during that period, so my vocation didn't require me to go and be anywhere. All my travel was canceled. You know, so there was this period where I could very comfortably and with a clear conscience sort of, you know, work from home and do what needed to be done that way. But, you know, Evan, you had a very different responsibility.
And For me, trying to figure out how to continue to lead services and Bible study and visit the sick and the hurting, we had at our Shepherd the intention, even in February, before we had even thought about COVID, we had signed a contract to increase our audio visual to be able to move towards live stream.
Oh.
So we had that material already on order. It didn't arrive in time for March 13th, and then that Sunday, March 15th, 2020, to go live stream. But we were using phones, and our first couple weeks were pretty poor, I think, in quality, but we quickly accelerated our quality to try to make sure whatever we could do, and returned back to in-person worship as fast as we could, and found ways. We marked the pews with tape to try to create distant social distancing markers.
Right.
Interesting. The tape we used ended up lifting some varnish off the pews, and so I can still see the spots on our pews. It's now faded a little bit, but I can still see the spots on our pews where we had put that tape.
Oh, wow. So one of the interesting things that Luther talks about here as he's going through our responsibilities to either stay or leave is he goes, it is not forbidden, but rather commanded that we seek our daily bread, clothing, and all the necessities of life in the sweat of our face, and avoid harm and trouble where we can.
Avoid harm and trouble where we can means that there are times when I don't have to be in harm's way. In fact, I shouldn't unnecessarily place myself in harm's way just to be a false hero.
And this is one of those, so often when we get into Luther's theology, there's so many different levels of tension that are always there, and it doesn't matter if you're talking about law gospel tension, or or in this case, the tension between your vocation as a whatever, pastor, policeman, whatever, and your responsibility to keep yourself safe. And so there's this tension that exists that is consistent in so many ways.
And it's faithful to get out of danger. I like the examples he gives about places where demonstrably it should be something you do, that is flee, right? He goes, am I supposed that if a house is on fire, no one must run out of it, and no one must attempt to rescue those inside? This fire is a punishment of God. Or that if somebody falls into a lake, he should not swim out, but allow himself to drown as a punishment from God? Well, if you are able, do so without tempting God. But let others do what they are able to do. Again, if a person breaks a leg or is wounded or bitten, must he avoid medical aid and say, it is God's punishment, and so I shall endure it until it heals itself? Cold and frost are also God's punishment, and one could die of them. Why do you run to a fire or into a house when it is cold? Be strong and stay out in the cold until it becomes warm again. It's just this tension he goes, like, if there's a house on fire, run out of it. But don't begrudge someone who needs to run in there to rescue someone either.
Yeah. It's, it's funny because what this does in Luther's theology, and I think it's one of the great things about Luther's theology is it's so practical, and it leaves so much room to grace, to the individual to make a faith-filled decision and be comfortable in that. That you have the right to be comfortable in, yes, you can run it, you can run out of a burning building, and that's okay. You can run into a burning building, and that's okay. So long as it's all done in faith.
So a good summary conclusion that he writes is, from all of this we conclude that we should pray against all manner of evil, and should also defend ourselves against evil insofar as we are able, provided that in doing so we do not act against God. So I like this idea that we should pray against all manner of evil, but we should also defend ourselves against all manner of evil.
Yeah.
I am not required by God to just take everything that happens and say, well, it's a punishment for God. I can't do anything about it. I can run out of a building that's on fire. I can swim out of a lake instead of drown in it. There are things I can do, and in fact, I should do.
And you should do, yeah. Luther gets into this discussion of, he gives these examples of all the different, faithful people who ran, and for whatever reason, whether it's David running from Absalom or Moses running from the Pharaoh who wanted to kill him. He has all these different examples, and he gets into this dialogue he has these imaginary dialogues that he gets into, and he says, "Oh yeah, but weren't they fleeing from persecution at that point?" And Luther comes back with this. I thought it was a pretty good quote. He says, "Yes, you will say, but these are not examples of dying in pestilence, but of being killed as a result of persecution." Luther answers, "Death is death, no matter by what means it comes." And that's actually, I think I like that, because there's this.
I can fight against death.
Yeah.
And I don't have to just take something and say, well, that must be God's will.
Right. That, oh, well, okay, I can try and escape death if it's because of religious persecution, okay, I'll do that. But it's when it comes to pestilence, when it comes to facing up to the Black Plague, well, I have to face up to that. No, the fact is that death is death. And we have a right to run from the plague, in this case, if it does no harm to anybody else. And that's sort of where I like that. It goes into this whole thing, into the four types of pestilence, or the four types of it has pestilence,
so
famine,
the four punishments:
sword.
pestilence, famine, sword, noisome beast.
Noisome beast. I love the word noisome.
I've not used that one. I need to include that.
I have to put that in my vocabulary.
But any of these punishments don't get the application of one kind of punishment is a godly punishment and another kind of punishment is a secular punishment. And you can flee secular punishments, but you have to stand up against godly punishments and just take them. No, he says death is death.
Right. And I like that. If you're this we have and I know I've been guilty of this, is a tendency to look at like religious persecution as being something different than just persecution, and Luther is saying, no, it's persecution. It's death is death, however you want to look at it. And there's this holistic attitude Luther brings into our vocations, into our work, into everything that we do, where our faith is a part of everything that we do. It's not just isolated to what happens within the church. It's, our faith journey includes every aspect of our life. And so I'm still honestly trying to work through exactly what that means, but it's one of these things, because I'm guilty of sort of looking at my, historically, especially when I was younger, I had my faith life and then my worldly life, and I didn't really mix them too much. Where now, as I get older, I'm seeing it, oh no, this is a holistic thing. This is part of everything I do. And
so when will I know if God's with me? That means it's a godly place, or if God's not with me, it must be an ungodly place. He says, if God desires that we suffer evil and be overcome by it, our defense will not help us. So how do we know if God desires that we suffer evil? It's more, I don't look to whether it's a godly moment or an evil moment. I look to what is my vocation in that moment.
And that's where vocation comes in. It's so important that we
So not a faith-filled moment, so I've got to suffer there. A secular moment, I don't need to suffer in the secular world. No, in all those moments.
It's a godly. It's a faith. Our faith is part of all of it.
Our vocation
and our vocation is and that's sort of this idea of vocation brings, at least for me, it brings my faith more effectively into my work. Where, and that's something I really love this particular letter. It was helpful through the whole COVID thing, but he really drives on that vocation and the importance of vocation. Mm-hmm. And I like this.
And so then he says there are general guidelines, though, about special situations where the need is urgent and we are the only ones who can help. How do we handle those moments of interruption?
So he says, we first of all, if we're the only ones there, we have to help. So yeah, let's say you're at your home and your neighbor's house is on fire, and the fire department is nowhere to be seen. Of course, you're going to go over there and try and help. That you have a responsibility. That's an urgent situation. Your vocation, this is an urgent situation. You need to step in.
It may interrupt your dinner.
It may interrupt your dinner.
Or it may interrupt something else.
Right.
What it gets to is that helping our neighbor will always involve us in some sense of interruption or loss or neglect of our own interests for the care of our neighbor.
And this is where Luther is, up until this point, we were talking about vocation. And so at this point, and from here on out in the rest of the letter, he starts talking about these special situations where, okay, the systems that have been set up aren't going to work at the moment. And what do we do in those kinds of situations? Like this one. It's an urgent need. It doesn't matter that you're not a fireman. Go help, or whatever it is.
And to figure out how to help in a way that I can do so and really be helpful. If you don't know how to swim, it doesn't make sense to jump in the water and try to rescue someone who's drowning. But there's something you can do, whether it's to run to go find someone else.
Throw a rope out there.
You can't just say, well, it's not my vocation as a lifeguard to help them, so they're going to drown.
Right.
You find something you can do.
Do something. Do something. But don't put yourself, don't jump into a lake if you can't swim. Just good advice. So
let's take our beer break. Today we're going to feature a brew by Shorts Brewing up in Bel Air, Michigan. Soft Parade. What do you think of this beer?
It was it's a real fruity beer. It sort of surprised me how much fruit flavor there was. It's a pink beer. That's
pink. It's pink. It's called a fruit ale with blueberries, strawberries, raspberries, and blackberries. An epitome of Shorts innovation and flavor, with a full pound of fresh strawberry, blueberry, blackberry, and raspberry puree crammed in every gallon of wort for a berry immersion unlike any other. And this particular one is interesting because they have one version of Soft Parade that's just the fruit ale, and then they make another one called a Soft Parade Shandy. So let's talk about, what does a shandy do? It just adds lemonade.
Oh, is that it?
That's all it is. Yeah.
Okay. I didn't know that.
So like a summer shandy is just a beer with some lemonade in it.
So this you can taste the lemonade. It has that little lemonade twang to it, but it sort of gets lost with all the other flavors,
with the full pound of fresh strawberry, blueberry, blackberry, and raspberry puree crammed into every gallon of wort.
It is certainly a summertime beer. This is I think this will be probably posted here.
It's a little tart. You saw my face. Mike just saw my face, and my eyebrows all move as I swallowed a big gulp.
So this is it's certainly a summertime beer. I think this is going to be posting in October time frame, so probably not really a good wintertime beer. The picture is somebody sitting on a folding chair, just enjoying the heat, it looks like. So this is certainly a summertime beer, and I'd say it's good for what it is. How do I? It's got that sort of a strong lemon taste.
Mm-hmm. So and the Soft Parade as a category beer up at Shorts has been around since 2007. It was originally part of their Imperial Beer series, which Joe believed, not either of us, part of Shorts Brewing. Joe writes that he believed it was a turning point for their company, a catalyst for propelling them to the next level of brewing greatness. And it really was about that time that Shorts became more just than the typical craft beer. They really started to explore with a lot more flavor.
Yeah, I think this really did take off. I started seeing the Soft Parade at the beer store, and I'm sure it's a very popular beer. It would be a good beer for hanging out in the sun. And I think it's a nice light beer you can down pretty easily.
So, Bel Air, Shorts Brewing, Soft Parade Shandy, a fruit ale with lots of fruit in it.
So let's get back. After Luther talks about these urgent situations where, let's say your neighbor's house is on fire or somebody's drowning, if you don't do something, Luther spends a whole paragraph just raking you over the coals.
He says, anyone who refuses to help his neighbor, who allows him to remain in need, and who flees from him is a murderer in God's sight. As St. John says in his epistle, he that loves not his brother is a murderer. And again, whoso has this world's goods and sees his brother has needs, how dwells the love of God in him?
So I actually, Luther's quote was, he that loveth not his brother is a murderer. And I thought, I have never heard that before. And so I went and looked up ESV, how ESV translated that. And it says, if you hate your brother, rather than if you loveth not your brother. So,
but the emphasis of placing in the first part of the phrase, if you do not love your brother, really brings the point to it's not just avoid hating your brother. The real emphasis is on find opportunity to love your brother.
And that was one of the things I sort of, it reminded me of the Large Catechism, where, in the Large Catechism, Luther spends a lot of time with thou shalt not steal. Well, on top of that, you should be generous with what you've got. And so there's this sort of
the synonym, the antonym, the positive, the negative, all those kind of things. The commandments are never just about avoid doing something.
Right. And it seems like he's doing the same thing here, and that's of course very biblical. But that was it was just sort of I never heard that before.
And the prophet Ezekiel highlights that this was the sin of Sodom. Pride and fullness of bread, yet she did not strengthen the hand of the poor and the needy. So it's interesting for me that Luther would bring up Sodom not as a sexual thing,
right,
but as a lack of care for the poor and the needy.
Yeah, an ethical, more on the larger ethical concerns.
And he says on the last day, there will be judgment.
Yeah. This next section, after he gets through with all that, he has this one comment. It's almost like a throwaway comment, and he never comes back to it. But he talks about, to be sure, it would be good, praiseworthy, and Christian for towns and lands that can do so to make provisions for the maintenance of community houses and hospitals, and for people to minister in them, so that all the sick can be gathered from all homes and committed there. It was, this call for what we've got today. That every community has a hospital, someplace that can serve people that way. And what that call, it sort of, in my mind, as I was reading that, it reminded me of, sort of took me back to Luther's time when there was none. We get so used to, well, of course there's going to be hospitals around. Well, no, there weren't. There were very few hospitals in this era. And it was really up to your neighbors to help each other out. This is sort of one of the other things we've talked about was this desire where we're like, okay, we'll leave that to the experts, and we've sort of stepped away from our responsibility.
He sees it as a groundswell activity that it would be good, praiseworthy, and Christian for towns and lands.
Yeah,
that there's this community responsibility. It's not. It would be good, praiseworthy, and Christian for the leaders to do something. It's the community that makes this possible.
Right. And it's that it's just sort of reminded me of the difference between today and Luther's day.
Yeah, the professional corporation of a hospital sometimes can have a sense of distance from the local community.
Yeah. Anyway, and then the next section here is he goes into giving advice to those who are called to care for the dying.
So when people are beginning to die, we should stay with them, make preparation to counteract the disease, and assure ourselves, especially those of us who have such responsibilities toward others, as I mentioned above, that we cannot leave or flee. We should be comforted by our certainty that it is God's punishment sent upon us, not only to punish sin, but also to test our faith and love. And I thought, Mike, you've done a great job highlighting that vertical test of faith and that horizontal test of love. why don't you talk a little bit more about that?
So one of the things, this test of faith and test of love, the tests of faith help us to understand our attitude towards God, and tests of love help us to understand our attitude toward our neighbor.
So an event can be both tests, but as I look at an event, it's just between me and God. No, there's always some interaction between me and my neighbor in this event.
And when Christ said all the laws is captured in love God and love your neighbor, it really does. It's almost impossible to untangle those two, right? It's difficult to love God without loving your neighbor. You can, and that's sort of what Luther's getting at here, is that we have this responsibility by loving God. Of course we're going to love His creation and those that God has put nearby us, we'll say.
And then Luther's going to highlight, if some pestilence is an evil event, can we even imagine if God is working in this event? He writes, although I believe that every pestilence, like other plagues, is spread among the people by evil spirits who poison the air or somehow exhale a noisome breath and inject deadly poison into men's bodies, nevertheless it is also God's will and punishment. Accordingly, we should submit to it patiently and risk our lives in the service of our neighbor, as St. John teaches, because Christ laid down his life for us. We ought to lay down our lives for the brethren. So I found it interesting that he's got some thought that there's some evil spirit, some noisome breath. I'm not sure if he sees it all as a spiritual spirit, or if he describes, as you might say, the humors or the airs. But he realizes that there's something evil going on.
Yeah.
And he describes it both as an evil spirit and as a noisome breath.
That noisome breath, when I first read that, I was thinking, this is sort of like the first one of the 400 years before the discovery of germs.
Yeah.
That he's already thinking in terms of, I bet there's something there. There's a noisome breath. There's something in the breath that is a problem here.
But he also describes it as God's will and punishment. And this
Right.
is always difficult for me, is I want to make things very secular, a very secular science, a secular illness or something like that. Just what I mean by that is it's an illness of this moment. It doesn't have eternal consequences. It's just a secular moment, just a moment of time someone is sick. But Luther has this ability to say that God is there too.
Yeah. And that gets back to what I when he talked about the test of faith and love, that when somebody's sick, that is a test of faith and love. It's not just their kidneys are having problems and there's or whatever is happening. There is this test of faith and love that we are all called to, that person, to trust God in that moment, for all of us to trust God as we're having these problems, and for all of us to trust, to love our neighbor as we go through these trials.
So we can get enveloped in dark clouds of fear and worry that can take hold of us, and he describes 4 things that may happen as these dark clouds are taking hold of you. One is we can despair of this life.
Another one is we can despair of God.
We can lose sight of Christ.
Or we can forsake a neighbor in need.
And in all of these will lead us, if we go unchecked, in sinning against man and God.
So all of these 4 things come out of it, according to Luther. These are the 4 things as we fear death, as that fear of death grabs hold of us, then it's easy to start despairing of God. It's easy to start despairing of to lose sight of Christ, and this is something I wish he would have put more time into explaining what he meant here.
And I think as you look to these 4 things and the fears that will grab us, as pastoral care happens, I need to listen to where someone is at. If they're losing sight of Christ, I can point them back to Christ. If they're despairing that God is present, I can give them confidence that God is present in the midst of our sins and in our iniquities, bringing rescue and redemption. Or if they're despairing of this life and think life doesn't matter at all, I might as well die because nothing matters anymore, I can let them know this is a day the Lord has made. You can rejoice that this day as a day of blessing. Or if they have forsaken their neighbor in need. I know pastorally, God has called you to love and care for those around you. It is important, if we're trying to offer aid in a spiritual way to someone, to know which of these four are they particularly struggling with. And Luther says all four of these can hit someone.
Yeah.
So let's be ready to respond spiritually to these.
I think you have, I know you have a lot more experience with this kind of thing than I do. I don't find myself in hospital rooms very often. And so I am not very familiar with the kind of emotional and spiritual struggles people are having. When I go to a hospital room to visit somebody, they're happy to see me. I'm happy to be there. We sit, talk about whatever. I'm just looking to help them pass the time. I look at that as like they are bored. That seems to me to be.
I'll be some entertainment for the moment.
I'll get you through the next hour or whatever.
And I think I wish I had more of that in a sense, because when I am at a hospital, I find it very hard to just sit there with the person. I need to do more of that. But while I am there,
you have a job to do, though.
I have a job to do.
Yeah.
My vocational responsibility is different than yours.
Yeah.
While I'm in the hospital.
I show up and I'm just sort of, when my dad was dying, I spent pretty much all day with him. My work made it possible for me to be with him all day, every day for a month.
And it wouldn't be right to think that all day of every month you're going to have these hugely significant spiritual conversations.
No.
That'd be too intense. It'd be
Most,
awkward to fill every conversation with, "So, Dad, are you today despairing of life? Or is today the day you despair of God? Have you lost sight of Christ today? Or have you forsaken your neighbor?" Just to know, where are we at today, Dad?
What are you struggling with today? And mostly it was just...
Let me go to my tabbed binder to figure out how to respond today.
Mostly I just sort of sat there and we'd talk about, like, whatever. It was like, the Tigers had a great game last night. This happened or that happened. And it was just passing the time. It was just, hey, your nurse is coming in and we're going to be, let's go for a ride in your wheelchair around and I'd make fun of, we'll race around and try and beat the old woman who's in, whatever. And just pass the time. And that's what I do but this is something different than what I do.
I think where Luther starts to lead into Psalm 41 gives room for both of what we're trying to do. He introduces Psalm 41 by saying, "Blessed is he that considers the poor. The Lord will deliver him in time of trouble. The Lord will preserve him and keep him alive, and he shall be blessed upon the earth. And thou wilt not deliver him unto the will of his enemies. The Lord will strengthen him upon the bed of languishing. Thou wilt transform his whole bed in his sickness." So I think that psalm speaks to both the caretaking of the soul and just considering the poor among us, and knowing how that line describes it, that the Lord will strengthen him upon the bed. What does strength look like? It doesn't always look like that we need in the next 5 minutes to figure out all of your eternity.
Right.
Maybe you're his son, you know where your dad's faith is, and now you just need to strengthen the bed of those who are poor in spirit.
And just hang. So it was the Luther actually, talking. Let's great to segue using this Psalm 41, because Luther launches from Psalm 41. He says, "Hey, listen, in Psalm 41 there are all these promises." Evan just read them, and I numbered them out.
Why don't you number those 7 promises? As I just kind of read them, you may have said, "Oh, that's a nice psalm." But there's some specific promises here.
Yeah, so the first promise is the Lord will deliver him, and if you consider the poor, then the Lord will deliver you in times of trouble, number 1. Number 2, the Lord will preserve you. Number 3, the Lord will keep you alive. Number 4, the Lord, and you shall be blessed upon the earth. Number 5, the Lord will not deliver him unto the will of his enemies. Number 6, the Lord will strengthen you upon the bed of your languishing. And number 7, the Lord will transform your whole bed in your sickness. And that, in the modern translation, in his illness, restore him to full health.
I like the idea that your whole bed becomes transformed from sickness to health. So I could still be laying in that bed, but now the bed is a transformed place. It's no longer a place of languishing. It's a sacred place where God is at work.
Yeah, and so you have these promises of Psalm 41, and Luther says, as you're going out to serve those in need, hold on to these promises. These are promises God has made you as the person who is doing His work in the face of suffering. And so he says, it addresses those who are ministering to the sick on the strength of these comforting promises, the next paragraph. And he starts talking about how, if you do that, if you rely on the promises of Psalm 41 as you go out into the world to serve the suffering, God Himself will minister to you. And one of the interesting things is, and I think this is where he says, even if you're getting paid for it, even if you're getting healthy wages, God will still minister to you.
And so, as I experience this time of ministering to the sick with love, devotion, and earnestness, Luther says there will be preservation. And I don't know if he thinks that there's a certain immunity. If you're doing God's work, you can't get sick, as much as he says, even if finally inflicted and defiled and afterward die, you've been someone who has been a part of how God has delivered promises.
Yeah.
And so your immunity isn't immunity from the plague. It's you gain an immunity when you care for another person from the attacks of the devil. The shield of faith.
I think a lot about the importance of faith. Our faith is like any other muscle, right? The more we use it, the stronger it gets. And I think that what Luther is referencing here is when you go and serve others in faith, it strengthens that faith. And as your faith gets stronger, you are preserved. And yeah, you might not be preserved from the plague, but you're preserved in your heart.
Yeah. So don't be afraid of the devil's terror, forsaking those to whom we have obligations. If we do forsake our obligations, we are not just hurting our neighbor, we are also disregarding the promises of God. So there he introduces the idea that if you disregard your neighbor, you are also disregarding where God's promises can be. God's promises can be present in the life of what your neighbor is experiencing.
So then Luther goes in and he basically rewrites Psalm 41 to be a bunch of curses. And he says, listen, but if you run from your neighbor and he needs you, he goes,
Cursed is the one that considers not the poor, but flees and forsakes. He brings that idea again that the Lord will not deliver him in times of trouble, but will also flee from him and forsake him. The Lord will not preserve him and keep him alive, nor will he bless upon the earth, but he will deliver him into the hands of his enemies. The Lord will not strengthen him upon the bed of languishing, nor transform. That rewriting of Psalm 41 is, if you forsake God's promises, then this is the world you live in.
Right. And then he go almost immediately after that, he goes into this whole thing. Oh, but if it were Christ or Mary who was sick,
everybody would jump and run to hell.
Everybody's going to be there. And he goes, yeah, no.
And then Luther reminds you of Matthew 25, where it says, inasmuch as you've done it to one of the least of these, my brothers, you've done it unto me. And that reminder that when you act towards the least among you, you are in fact acting to Christ.
Right. And he goes, so rather just go and minister to your neighbor, and you will most assuredly find Christ in him, in his suffering. So that the next section is
This is where he starts to get into medicine and the idea that you do need to take for yourself.
Yeah. And he's talking about these people in his era, and who say, you know what, I'm not going to worry about it. If I'm going to die, I'm going to die. So they go and they start, and he goes, drink and play is the term Luther used, with the sick, saying, if God wants to protect me from the plague, he will do so without medicine or any effort on my part.
He says, take whatever may be helpful to you. Fumigate your house, yard, and street. Avoid persons and places where you are not needed or where your neighbor has recovered. Act as one who would like to help put out a general fire. What is a pestilence, after all, but a fire which consumes body and life instead of wood and straw?
And what Luther's getting at here is God created medicine. This isn't, we almost, there is this temptation, I think it's probably more prevalent even today than Luther's day, but that we see all these great creations around us and we don't recognize that this is God's creation too. Yeah, so, some guy developed the...
Medicine becomes a godless thing and faith becomes godly.
Right.
And if I take medicine, I must be godless. And he says, no, take the medicine, fumigate your house. Do whatever may be helpful to you.
Right. So try to keep yourself healthy and try to keep yourself from becoming a source of illness. This is that transmission point that we heard so much about during COVID, is the importance of not allowing yourself to become a transmission point to others.
He says, whoever has succumbed to the pestilence and has recovered should likewise avoid people and be reluctant to have them near without necessity. So if you're someone who's recovering, Luther says, be cautious. Don't just walk about. If you're recovering, that's dangerous.
Yeah. Luther then, this is getting down near the end, he talks about in an ideal town what the people would be like and how it would run. And he says basically three things. In an ideal town, first of all, the people are bold in their faith when required by their neighbor. Number two, but they're careful when there is no need. And number three, they are helpful in counteracting the poison wherever possible.
And in the reality, two things often happen. One, people become overly fearful, abandoning their responsibilities. Or two, overly bold and unnecessarily spreading disease.
So what he goes, both of these are bad, but then he brings the third one in, whereas the very worst are those who knowingly spread the disease. And they
contract the pestilent disease, they keep it secret, they go out among other people, and they think that if they can infect and defile others with the sickness, they themselves will get rid of it and become well. He has this notion that there are some people who think that there is a disease in them, and if they can transmit it to more people, then the disease will be less in them.
Yeah, that's such a weird thing to think about. But yeah, I could see how...
If I could dilute my disease by sharing it with many other people, then I'll get better? Luther's like, no, that's...
No, don't do that.
Don't do that. Even if he's not a scientist, Luther knows that's bad science.
Yeah. And then he says, and then there's another group who says, you know what, I don't like Joe down the street, and I've always hated him, and now I've got the plague, I'm going to wander over there and have dinner with him. And those are the very worst. These people who intentionally infect others. And it's hard for me to, it's sort of like, I guess in the early 1900s, there was Typhoid Mary, a woman who everybody she came in contact with got typhoid, and she just never got sick.
She had she was a asymptomatic carrier.
Yeah.
Is that the idea?
Yeah, and so everybody knew Typhoid Mary, but that was it's that kind of person that Luther.
They're like assassins who plunge a knife into a person so stealthily that it cannot be determined who did it. So these people infect a child here and a woman there, and nobody knows how it happened. Meanwhile, they go away laughing as if they've done a good deed.
Yeah. Oof. And then Luther calls for those kinds of people to be, just get the hangman. Just kill him. Yeah. Which, okay, that might be a little over the top, but Luther is just so done with those people that he at least have some legal retribution, is what he says. He goes, okay, maybe not kill him, but at least have some legal retribution.
We're coming to a close of our letter here, where we've been looking at Luther's letters of spiritual counsel during times of epidemic and famine. There are other categories of letters in this collection of letters that Theodore Tappert brought together. We've so far covered comfort the sick and dying, comfort the bereaved, and now we did advice in times of epidemic and famine. Mike and I will discuss. We've got some more letters we can look at, but
we would love to hear from you. If there's anything you would like us to cover, if there are other subjects.
So there's a poll opportunity.
Yeah.
So admonition to be steadfast and courageous in your faith, instructions for those who are in trouble or in need, encouragement to the persecuted and imprisoned, counsel for those who have questions about marriage and sex, suggestions for problems facing clergymen, and exhortations concerning rulers in the state. Maybe we'll put a little poll up there and you can, listeners, help us to know where to go next.
That would be great. We'd love to hear from you. Until next time, cheers.